Hey, hi guys. So today we're going to be talking about animation. So animation is one of the more complex multimedia techniques. It's one that you would obviously be very familiar with if you've ever seen a cartoon or 3D animation or really anything that kind of doesn't exist in real life. So most CGI can be considered a type of animation if we're going to boil it down to its most simple thing. So in the syllabus, we are now onto page 95 and we are going to today to go through the entire animation section. So it's not that large, it's divided into 2D animation, 3D animation, and virtual reality. And honestly, the virtual reality section is not really worth talking about. You need to consider that it was written in 2008, so I'm going to add some extra things into that to help you out with it, but we'll start off with 2D animation. So 2D animation is what you would, kind of functions like a diorama. You've got flat layers that we view from the top. So if you think about it, it's like pieces of paper that are laid one on top of each other, and originally this was the way that we actually did animate. So we had a camera that was on top, so you would have sort of a rig that might have been made of metal with a camera attached to it. You would put your piece of paper or your cells down, depending on what sort of animation you had. You would take a shot, you would move it slightly, take another shot, you would do it at however many frames per second you were shooting at, so it would have to be above 8 to 12, it might be at 24 frames per second, back up to 30, and you would take one shot for every frame of footage. It was very time intensive. We then changed to different types of animation after that, where it's become a little bit more easy, especially with the introduction of computers. But when we had that original sort of one frame at a time thing, that was usually called cell animation. So the old Disney films are made using cell animation, Snow White, Alice in Wonderland, that sort of thing. So to understand what a cell is, it's spelled C-E-L, I used to say it's overhead projector paper almost, see-through plastic acetate. But now you guys don't seem to understand what overhead projectors are because you weren't in school when overhead projectors were used, which makes me feel incredibly old. But basically, it's a see-through piece of plastic that you can paint onto or draw onto, and then you can lay them on top of each other. If you're really unsure what a cell is, you can think of it like Photoshop. So you know in Photoshop how you have layers and the layers stack one on top of each other and you can see through the layer to the other one as long as you don't have something painted on that layer. It works like that. So I've got my background layer here, and I've got my camera here, and then anything that I put in front of it will be see-through as long as I don't paint on that layer. So if I had a seat of a car on this layer, I could put my character on a layer in front of it, and I wouldn't see the seat where the character was sitting, so they would be covered by their back, but I might see the headrest behind their neck, and so on and so forth. So each of those are usually drawn by hand in cell animation. They're layered on top of each other, which allows for depth of field as well, because we can move those layers forwards and backwards. So Disney invented a camera system where these cell layers could actually be moved in and out, as well as the camera moved forward, which would allow for a thing called parallax, and that's used really well in Bambi. If you want to go and take a look at, I think it's the starting scene of that where they're looking through the woods, you can see things come into focus and out of focus, and there's some really cool YouTube videos on that. But let's talk about what parallax is, just quickly. I'm pretty sure it's not in the syllabus. So if you look at like old Tom and Jerry cartoons or old Flintstones or things like that, when they're walking, you'll notice that the background is often going at a different rate to the foreground. So you might have a background frame which is moving very slow and the characters are moving in front of it very fast. Now what that allows you to do is it gives you a realistic sort of movement, because the size of the mountain in the background is several kilometers. Okay, let's say it's a giant mountain, but your characters are moving at a pace that's like, 3 3 seconds per meter, let's say. They're walking real slow. So if you were to move that mountain in real time, it would move past way too quickly. So if you moved everything at the same pace, it wouldn't look like they were actually making any distance. So what you do is you move the background slowly, you have your characters move fast through it, and it gives this really cool illusion of movement. What you can do as well is you can put another layer in front of the characters, and that could even be out of focus slightly. And you can create these really cool illusions of movement in it. So the advantages of cell motion, when you've got all these layers and they're all hand done, you can get really detailed movement of your characters, but the negatives, it's very, very, very time intensive. So for example, you can create an animation by yourself now on your computer and it doesn't take that long. They would have used to have several hundred people working over different levels to create the same animation. So Walt Disney Studios had whole rooms of people who were just colorists. They had key artists. So the key artists would do the defined movement cells, and then they would have a whole bunch of in-between artists that went and did all of those little hand movements in between those main movements there. It took a lot of time. So we then came up with path-based animation. So path-based animation, I'm pretty sure, is just exclusively on computers. And when you do that, you put in a keyframe. So this is After Effects now, and I think maybe even Animate uses keyframe animation as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that because I don't use Animate because I hate Animate. So you have your starting motion. So let's use my hand as an example. So if I want my hand to move from here to here, if I'm doing cell-based animation, I have to draw each individual frame. If I use path-based animation, I put a keyframe here, I put a keyframe here. I pull those keyframes apart to say how many frames I want the movement to make, and then the computer does the rest. Now the computer will by default do that in a smooth animation, so it'll do it, it'll average out the distance amongst there and it can do that. But I can add in things like motion graphs, easy ease, all sorts of things using After Effects or a similar thing in other programs, and it will actually change the velocity over the course of it and make it look a little bit more realistic. A path-based animation is where a figure follows between keyframes that are set up by the animator. Another one in the syllabus that we need to talk about is stop motion and claymation. Stop motion and claymation are almost exactly the same as that old cell-based animation, but in stop motion and claymation often you're using real objects. So stop motion, you might just be using, I don't know, like this pen ink that's lying on the table because I can't think of anything else. In stop motion, you would take a picture of this, you'd move it slightly, take another picture, another, and then over time when you play it back, it would look like it's moving like that, okay? Claymation is exactly the same as stop motion, but you use clay, okay? Claymation, popularized by Aardman Studios. They made Wallace and Gromit, Chicken Run, a whole bunch of other films that aren't really made anymore. The reason why they're not made anymore is because it's incredibly labor intensive and it's way quicker to make a 3D movie. It's pretty easy to make a 3D movie once you've designed your characters, as long as you have the processing power for it, which is why we get garbage like the Emoji Movie, because it's way cheaper to make that movie than to make a 2D animated movie, and that's a shame, okay? But you can do some really cool stuff with 3D animation, don't get me wrong. Okay, so we've talked about path animation. Now I want to talk about, let's continue talking about path animation. So we've got tweening and in-betweening. So tweening is what we call those computer-generated frames in between point A and point B. So the advantages is it's easier for us to do it and it's quicker because the computer does it for us. Disadvantages, we need a lot of processing power for it, and also sometimes the animation doesn't look too convincing because we don't move as humans in predictable paths. Things speed up and slow down randomly, you know, all that sort of stuff. So we need to add in all those extra little things, but once we do that, you can get some really cool effects with it, and you can get some really complex stuff, especially when you start like nesting and pre-comping and doing all that sort of stuff and bringing all these multiple things to go and animate at once. You can just do some stuff that you could never really do through cell animation without spending a ton of time doing it. Cell animation is the most flexible, but money. money and time is what changes everything. We've also lost a lot of the techniques that we once had with cell animation. So if you look at cell animation that was done in the early period of animation, they're actually better at it than we are now. I watched a documentary by the creators of one of the artists on Ren and Stimpy, which was a cartoon in the 90s, and they said that a lot of the work that they had to do was actually working out those cell animation techniques, because all of the original animators died without passing on their knowledge. And that's a shame, but that's the way it is. Moving on. I don't know whether you've realized, but animation is my favorite topic to talk about in multimedia. I just think it's a lot more interesting than some of the rest of it, so I kind of go off on tangents on this, and I apologize. Let's talk about rotoscoping. So rotoscoping is where you draw over something that's live action. And this is the way that Walt Disney Studios got a lot of their really realistic motion back in the 1940s and 50s. So when they have like Snow White dancing in some of the scenes in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, is that what it's called? I don't know. Anyway, they actually got a dancer in, and they filmed the dancer with a live action camera, and then they looked back at those frames and they drew over the top of them. And that gives you a really realistic sort of animation, because you're not just imitating life, you're copying life. And that can be a really interesting look. So pretty sure they did that with some Beauty and the Beast dancing scenes. I've got some examples of way back early where they did hula dances and rotoscoped that hula dancing to try and get the movements perfect on them. It's been used a lot in the past, and it's a really good way to do that. We create a mask over the top, or a mat, where we draw over that existing part of it. Rotoscoping doesn't just have to be complete versions of stuff as well. A great example that I often see my students doing is if they want to have like some sort of sci-fi battle with lightsabers because they want to copy Star Wars. So you need to actually rotoscope the swords and add glow to them. So what you do is you trace where the sword is on screen in every frame, and then you add a glow around that mask or that line that you draw onto that. So that's something that you can do as well that can look pretty cool. But yeah, rotoscoping, drawing over something that's usually live action to create an animated version of that. Moving on to behavioral animation. So in the syllabus it's called behavior animation, so always good to have a typo in something that you teach from. Behavioral animation uses mathematical coding to make a character animate on its own. So usually what we do is we put in a whole lot of if, then, or statements into a character, and then we set them free. So a lot of the time this is used with 3D models, even though it's under the 2D animation section of the syllabus, because it's used a lot in video games. So if we take, for example, something like the Grand Theft Auto series, a lot of the NPCs, the non-player characters, have behavioral animations attached to them. So it will be like, if in the vicinity of the player, then walk, unless weapon is pulled, then run away. Okay, so we don't have animations for every single second of that character's life. We have maybe 10 set animations with a whole bunch of rules set to them. So After Effects, probably not the most ideal program to be using behavioral animation in. I don't even know if you can. But Unity, a video games program, is a very good program to set up behavioral animation. So in the past, I'm going to bring back Star Wars again. So I've had a student who wanted to create a giant space battle with hundreds of ships in the air. So would he animate each of those ships and the shooting of those ships manually? No, it would take too much time. Instead, what we do is we set up a bunch of rules. So we have our ships target another ship and fly towards it. So we say, this ship is going to target this ship, they're going to fly at each other. And I mean, they don't have to fly at each other. I could have ship A targeting ship B targeting ship C targeting ship A, and they'll all just fly around in circles at each other. Then I can go, if ship gets within a certain point of other ship, fire laser. So then as my ships get closer to each other, as they inevitably will, and they hit a certain distance point, they fire at each other. Then I could have, if ship gets even closer, evade, because otherwise, eventually they're going to smash into each other. I can add a health script to that then, where if a laser hits it, the ship explodes, and all of a sudden, I can just duplicate that. I've got 100 ships on screen. They're all shooting at each other. I can screen record that, and my space battle is done. I can fly different cameras through it. Takes a little bit longer to get set up. Once you've got set up, behavioral animation can give you really cool effects. So a movie example of where that was done, Lord of the Rings, the massive orc battles. I don't know which Lord of the Rings it is, and I don't think it really matters because, let's be honest, it's probably in all of them. So there's hundreds of villains on screen, created in CGI. Now, our other option is to paint up a bunch of people and get them all to stand in there. Or you can do like what they did in Star Wars and create small little miniatures. So in the Phantom Menace, they had like a racing scene, and the big stands full of people were actually just cotton buds. You know, things like you clean out your ears, and they had some fans underneath to make them jump up and down. That can be fun. Or you can use behavioral animation, so you can have like if villain close to hero, slice, health, die, all that sort of stuff, okay? Cool. So morphing and tweening. So morphing is, once again, you switch from one into another. The syllabus sure does love the word morphing. It's in here like 5 times. And I'm not sure why, but now you know. Okay. When we're talking about tweening, that's those in-between things again when we're talking about our frame rates. Animation, 12 frames per second or more. The reason why we use a lower frame rate is basically because we used to have to draw them all, okay? So you could understand if you had to draw 12 pictures every second, that's better than trying to draw 24 frames per second, but over time, well, now that it's on computer, it doesn't really matter. So the higher your frame rate, the bigger your file's going to be. Animation files are already huge. 24 frames is totally good enough. You don't really notice any difference after that. Yeah, after that, there's not really much benefit to an animation being higher than that. I mean, it'll be smoother, but it's already pretty smooth because the computer is averaging out that movement as well. But it's up to you what you want to do. I then need to talk about transitions in animation. Transitions in animation are pretty much exactly the same as transitions in film. So you can have all of those other ones from the previous episode that we talked about, but transitions are how slides move from one to another. We can talk about looping, which is the next thing. So a loop in an animation is something that's very important in terms of time saving. So for example, a walk cycle might be 8 or 9 frames. I've got an image of a walk cycle here. So with that, you can see that you've got, when something walks, it can follow predictable patterns, okay? So we start off by putting one foot up in the air, we move forward, and then, you know, we shift our weight and move the other one, okay? So if we were filming something in real life, the walk wouldn't be exactly the same, but for an animation, we repeat the same loop. So what we can do is we can actually combine frame-by-frame animation with path-based animation, or we can use a path-based animation to do one single cycle of a loop. Once that loop is put in, we can pre-comp that in After Effects, so we can turn it into its own little file. And I'm going to use After Effects as my example again because it's just easier for me. And then we can set up an expression which changes the loop. So we can use the expression to make things repeat over and over again. So that saves us time because we don't have to repeat that same repetitive movement again. So looping can work really well to make things a little bit quicker for you. It can, because a lot of animation is a lot of repetition, especially when you're dealing with character animation. So if you're trying to lip sync a mouth to make it work, we can set that up to loop when it hears a certain voice, especially we can set different vocal phonemes to be like, you know, an A makes your mouth look a different way to an M to an S. So we can set those things up to loop, and I mean, it's up to you whether you actually want the mouth of your character to even be realistic. A lot of animation is just opens and closes and you don't really notice the difference. Anyway, talked about animation and we're already running long. So in the next episode, I'm going to move on to 3D animation and we'll finish off virtual reality there. Okay, thanks very much.